I'm going to move on to properties of water. And this is a picture of Crater Lake, one of the bluest lakes that I've ever seen in my life. And we'll talk about why. So this is a figure of bubbles that have formed in ice, and this helps us see one of the several properties of water, which is surface tension. So surface tension forces bubbles to be spherical, and the gas that can dissolve in liquid water cannot, of course, dissolve in solid water. So we'll talk more about bubbles as we move through this. Here's a picture of a water strider, also playing with the surface tension of water. And here is a bubble that this diving beetle has captured, an air bubble, and brings it underwater with him so that it can breathe the air in that bubble. And again, surface tension is helping hold that air in place. So how does all this surface tension work? Well, we have to start to understand the properties of water. So H2O, right? We have two H's and an O, and they form at this really interesting angle, 104 degrees. The oxygen attracts the electrons from the hydrogens. Okay, so if you're pulling electrons toward you, electrons have a negative charge, so the oxygen becomes negatively charged slightly. And because their electrons are pulled away, the hydrogens become slightly positively charged. The black lines represent the covalent bonds between the H's and the O's, and then the dashed lines represent what are called hydrogen bonds that form because of these slight positive and negative charges that have developed on the water molecule itself. And these hydrogen bonds are what hold water molecules together and provide water with that ability to create kind of a surface tension. That's part of it, okay? So without hydrogen bonding, water would be a gas at room temperature. Isn't that crazy? Okay, imagine if you couldn't just turn on the tap and pour a glass of water, but you had to like walk into a cold room to do that because of the hydrogen bonding. So surface tension is super important for animals, but water has all these other properties too. So it has a really high heat capacity, a heat of fusion, and a high heat of vaporization. So it resists change of state from ice to gas, from ice to liquid to gas, those different changes of state. High heat capacity means it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water by 1 degree. And it's a really great solvent. So when you put your dishes in the sink, you add a little water, right? Because that gets all the gunky stuff worked off. It also helps to weather rocks. It brings minerals into ecosystems. It helps to erode things. So there are lots of really cool things about water. Here's another cool thing, and there's a video that's linked below that you can watch. This is a basilisk lizard, Basilicus, and it can run across the surface tension of water. And it does that by creating pockets of air underneath its feet as it pushes down really fast. It pushes these pockets of air and it can like propel itself off of those pockets of air trapped by its webbed feet. So some other properties of water are it's very cohesive, which means that it's attracted to itself through those hydrogen bonds. But it's also very adhesive, which means it's attracted to other things like a glass. It will kind of cling up the side of your glass. And there's something called capillary action, which allows water to rise up a tube. So if you take a thin tube and you stick it in water, the water will actually rise up the tube. And this happens in sediments, it happens in aquatic plants. To some degree, it happens inside the xylem within trees. So capillary action is really important. And then it creates a meniscus. So if you put it into a test tube, it will climb up the sides all around. And that meniscus is really important because it creates a barrier. And some organisms have adapted to using that change in slope as it moves up the sides for propulsion. The other thing about water is that gas is soluble in water, but gas solubility is higher at depth. So that's what gives divers the bends, if you get bubbles of gas forming in your blood vessels. Carbon dioxide can become supersaturated in deep lakes, and there's some really interesting stories about lakes that have caused, CO2 kind of like explosion events, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. And that this supersaturated water from deep water can cause problems when it's released from the bottom of dams. So here's a picture of this meniscus movement I was talking about. So here you have kind of a water strider on the surface of the water, and you can see the meniscus, the water rising up the edge of the vessel, and it could be a barrier to this organism, like a steep hill, right? But instead, this organism has figured out how to move its body to actually propel it up the slope. And so the steep incline can actually be used to help the organism, where it could have been a barrier. It is a barrier for a lot of organisms too. Okay, so we're also going to talk a little bit about viscosity. Water viscosity is basically how kind of thick it feels. So if you imagine the difference between water versus honey versus molasses, you have increasing viscosity in molasses. And you can kind of see that in this image here, right? Something that's running freely, kind of streaming versus dripping versus oozing, right? Now, water doesn't necessarily have the degree from water to molasses, but it does have differences in viscosity. And those differences increase at smaller scales. So if you're a smaller organism, then water will feel more viscous to you. With greater water movement, so if you're trying to move really fast, water is going to feel really viscous. And at lower temperatures, water has increased viscosity as well. And then we have inertia. Inertia is the ability to resist movement, and inertia increases with size. So if you're a bigger organism, there's more inertia. It's harder to get moving. And if the density of the liquid you're moving in increases, then there's more inertia involved in your movement. And also the velocity. So if you ever tried to like walk up a stream, right? It's really hard to walk up that stream if it's moving really fast versus if it's moving really slow. So there's more inertia if there's more water velocity. So viscosity changes with temperature. Here we can see the viscosity is pretty high at low temperatures, and then it drops steadily as the temperature warms. So changes in temperature can influence how the water feels to organisms. And we can kind of pull all of this information together in what's called the Reynolds number. So a Reynolds number, it's called RE, and it quantifies the spatial and velocity related effects of both viscosity and inertia. And so it helps us understand why fish, like this fish at the bottom, has this streamlined shape versus a bacteria that really just is a blob, right? Why does the bacteria move through liquid as a blob, whereas the fish needs to be streamlined, okay? It also helps us understand why the size of particles that filter feeders can capture has a lower limit. So it also helps us understand why aquatic organisms might find refuge near solid surfaces. So the Reynolds number, RE, is a ratio of the inertial forces to the viscous forces. And if you plug in the equation for the inertial forces, F sub I, which is equal to the density of fluid times the surface area of the object times the squared velocity of the fluid. If you plug that in for F sub I and you plug in F sub V, which equals the dynamic viscosity times the surface area times the velocity divided by the length of the object, then you can cross some things out, right, that are in both places, and you can calculate the Reynolds number directly. And basically what it tells you is how the water feels when someone is trying to move through it. And water will feel more viscous when you're moving fast. If you're bigger or you're trying to pull a large object through the water, that will be harder. And if the water is colder, then it has increased hydrogen bonding, it has a higher dynamic viscosity, and so it will be harder to move through it. And so here you can see the Reynolds number, which is a function of size and velocity. So over here you can see the Reynolds number increasing on a logarithmic scale as the size of the organism increases. And you can see for a bacterium, it has a really low Reynolds number, really small size. And as you get larger, you have a higher Reynolds number, okay? The same is true for the velocity of the water for the most part. As the velocity of the water increases, you have a higher Reynolds number. And you can see where different organisms choose to live in terms of the speed of the water around them.